Welcome, everybody, to the virtual symposium series called Typologies of Interfaith Education. I'm Willemien Otten, a professor of theology and the history of Christianity at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, where I also currently direct the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. And this symposium has been organized and is hosted together with IFYC, Interfaith Youth Corps, and my partner at IFYC has been and is Noah Silverman, Senior Director for Strategic Partnership at IFYC. And in this venture, we've been generously funded by the Luce Foundation, without whose support we would have been unable to do this. It's been a very exciting series of virtual seminars so far. So we started last week with an opening seminar with Ibu Patel from IFYC and David Nierberg of the University of Chicago Divinity School. Then we had a Bible panel with biblical scholars. And on Monday, MLK Day, we had a panel with ethicists. But today, I think, is a new kind of venture because from the beginning, the Marty Center and IFYC wanted to bring together not just academics, not just thinkers, but also doers, also administrators. And today we have a chance to think, to hear what administrators think about interfaith education. And as we heard, the theme of today is where do we go from here? A reflection on the future of seminary and divinity school education in a post-COVID world. I'll turn it over now to Noah Silverman, who will chair the discussion. But I also want to let the audience know that during the discussion, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to address a number of them towards the end of our symposium. Have a great time.
Thank you, Willemien, and thank you to the Henry Luce Foundation and the Marty Center for this partnership and for making this possible. I am incredibly excited for the conversation that we'll be having this afternoon, this evening, on this really auspicious day, certainly in American history. I look forward to welcoming a panel of esteemed scholars and administrators and dear colleagues, new and old. So I will briefly go through introductions of our panel and ask them to turn on their cameras and join us, and then we will move into the discussion. So in alphabetical order, I'll start with Professor Syeed Davidson. Dr. Davidson serves as the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. He is also the Professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament and teaches courses that critically examine the Bible and its production through several generations in ways to understand the challenges for contemporary interpretation. Professor Davidson is a native of Trinidad and Tobago, earned a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Union Theological Seminary in New York, received an STM from Boston University, an MA from the University of the West Indies, and a Diploma of Ministerial Studies from the United Theological College of the West Indies, and a BA from the University of the West Indies. Next, we have Professor Richard Mao. Dr. Mao was a faculty member at Fuller Theological Seminary for 35 years. During that time, he served for 2 decades as the school's president. Prior to joining the Fuller faculty in 1985, he taught in the philosophy department at Calvin College for 17 years. After retiring from Fuller in 2020, Dr. Mao was appointed Senior Research Fellow in Christianity and Politics at Calvin University. Next, we have Professor Marianne Maillard. Dr. Maillard is Professor and Chair of Comparative Theology and the Hermeneutics of Interreligious Dialogue, and I'm sorry that my Dutch pronunciation is terrible, but at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where she teaches mixed-faith classrooms. She recently obtained a 5-year research grant to explore further the way mixed Christian Jewish and Christian Muslim marriages ritualize their daily lives. She has authored 2 books, including Fragile Identities for the Theology of Interreligious Hospitality, and has edited 5 others, including Interreligious Relations and the Negotiation of Ritual Boundaries. In addition, she has published over 50 articles, approximately half of which appear in peer-reviewed journals in both English and Dutch. Next, we have Professor Elias Ortega. Dr. Ortega has committed his life to building organizational systems in which people, especially those underrepresented in our society, can thrive. He uses the lenses of religious ethics, spirituality, and theological reflection to foster change in higher education, nonprofit organizations, and religious institutions. Currently, he serves as the President and Professor of Religion, Ethics, and Leadership at Wiedewell Lombard Theological School in Chicago. Dr. Ortega led cultural and institutional changes at the Unitarian Universalist Association through a 3-year assessment of the barriers that maintain racial exclusion practices inequality in the organization that resulted in recommendations for equitable practices and policies. He has also provided strategic planning and program support to community organizations, including the New Jersey Parent Caucus, a mental health and juvenile justice advocacy group, the Scylla Maria Cauldron Foundation, and the Drew Freedom School Initiative. Finally, we have Rabbi Or Rose. Rabbi Rose is the founding director of the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership of Hebrew College. Previously, he served as a founding faculty member and associate dean of the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College. He has taught for the Bromstone Youth Fellowships, the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, and in a variety of other academic, religious, and civic contexts throughout North America and in Israel. Recent publications include Words to Live By, Sacred Sources for Interreligious Engagement, and Rabbi Zalman Schechter Shalomi, Essential Teachings. He is the creator of Hebrew College's scriptural commentary blog, 70 Faces of Torah, curator of the web-based project Psalm Season, and co-publisher of the Journal of Interreligious Studies. And I apologize, I misspoke. We have one more esteemed panelist, Dr. Najeeba Syeed. She is the Associate Professor of Muslim and Interreligious Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary and Director of the Center for Global Peace Building. She is recognized as a leader in peace building and social justice-based research, and twice received the John Anson Ford Award for reducing violence in schools in the area of interracial gang conflicts, and was named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year in 2007. She has chaired national conferences on Muslim and interfaith peace building, served as a mediator in many cases, started restorative justice mediation programs in many institutions, including University of Southern California and several middle and high schools. Schools have reported a drop in disciplinary referrals and violence after her interventions. Her track record as a peacemaker and critical peace researcher has made her sought-out advisor, and she has served on the ground as a peace interventionist in conflicts around the globe. So please join me in welcoming this esteemed group of, as I said, scholars and administrators and colleagues. I would like to start by asking each of them in turn to respond to this sort of opening question. So the overarching theme for this entire symposium is a reflection on the disparate manner in which, quote unquote, interfaith education is being pursued in seminary and divinity schools across the country and indeed across the Atlantic. The supposition behind the symposium is that more often than not, interfaith education is deployed in service to more essential and underlying political or theological commitments, rather than constituting an academic category with its own intellectual foundations. Since the six of you represent institutions with varying religious and political commitments, I'd like to ask you to begin by offering a reflection on how interfaith education is constituted at each of your respective institutions. Professor Davidson, let's start with you.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity for us to gather together to have this conversation. I think it's a vitally important one for many reasons, some of which we may talk about a little later today. So McCormick Theological Seminary is a seminary within the Presbyterian tradition. And the work in interfaith education may have begun at a point that was fairly reflective of what interfaith education may have been in many instances. That is to say, to get Christians largely to be hospitable to people of other faiths, and people of other faiths as defined largely by the book, right? This notion of that there is this book or a kind of a text culture that unifies faith was, I think, sort of a broad supposition. And in some senses, they cannot be that bad, and we could have some conversation. So it's this way of developing tolerance and some level of respect. And do that through contact with people of other faiths. Recently, we have decided to push our education a little bit further into trying to think not just simply of ways in which we can achieve tolerance, which is not always a very positive goal, but to think of how we can teach and prepare faith leaders who will operate within the public square, attentive to the pluralism of communities, and religious pluralism being one of them, as well as the fact that pluralism is defined by people who hold no faith commitments. And for sort of predominantly and historically Christian institution, that means attending to the issues of Christian supremacy and Christian dominism and Christian nationalism, which even if without talking about those things in very explicit ways, can be easily embedded within the theologies and cultures of the institution itself. And what we have tried to do is to shift the way in which we teach traditional Christian courses. That is to say, as we look at the histories of Christianity, we need to examine how Christianity emerged and evolved alongside of other types of religious movements and practices in the same historical period. So rather than trying to emphasize the sense that here is a history that's marked only by Christian presence, is how is Christianity co-constituted with other religious entities? Similarly, as we pursue Bible, as we do a number of other courses. So yes, we will kind of hold on to some of the traditional ways within which we think that people need to gain content and knowledge about other religions, but at the very same time, we have to attend to the ways in which we teach Christian traditions, Christian practices, Christian histories, and hermeneutics, and all of those other things as being representative of a world that has always been plural, rather than simply communicating the fact that somehow or the other pluralism is this new thing and this magical thing that we have to address, but it is already there within the system. The reason, of course, we're doing this is to shape a different set of public-facing graduates, of people who will operate very differently as representatives of faith within the public square. And I could talk some more about that a little bit later, but I'll leave it there and ask, give opportunities for my other colleagues.
Thank you, Professor Davidson. Professor Mao?
Yeah, thank you. I want to sort of reaffirm my colleagues' word of appreciation to you folks for putting this on and having us engaged, and for the diversity of this panel, which is a wonderful thing, and thank you, Noah. Fuller Theological Seminary has been around for seven or so decades, founded in the late 1940s, came into an evangelical world where there was a lot of interfaith engagement, but it was mainly in the form of missionary activity, sending people off to the Southern Hemisphere, to villages and tribes and various cultural contexts, but without much cultural savvy, without much cultural sensitivity. Actually, Fuller in the 1960s established, 1950s actually established a School of World Mission, which kind of led the way in the evangelical world for the sociological, anthropological study of cultural contexts. It was largely anthropology in relationship to cultural context, not a lot of emphasis on interfaith, more intercultural or cross-cultural or transcultural dialogue kinds of things. Although gradually, given the fact that Fuller, certainly during my 35 years there, has always had at least 70 nations represented in its evangelical student body. And obviously the questions come up all the time in a lot of different contexts for people for whom interfaith engagement has been very much a part of their daily lives. But in many ways, and I'm being more prescriptive here than descriptive, one of my gripes has been that interfaith often becomes kind of a curricular option. You put it off to the edges of the curriculum, and people can take it or not, but it's not integrated into the whole curriculum. It's not a part of the overall formation. And so I would want to say that I think we've made some progress in this, but that there are three things that are very important. One is just personal encounter, personal engagement. My Jewish friends have initiated something called InterSem. Some of you will be familiar with that in other parts of the country, but there have been some of my students who said this was the weekends at InterSem were the most important experiences they had in their whole theological education. And the friendships that have formed between rabbinic students and evangelical students. And in fact, in many ways, that's the most focused kind of set of relationships, although there are mainline and Catholic seminarians who are present there as well. But personal engagement has been very good. So when I've taught interfaith understanding type courses, we've always had a Jewish scholar, we've always had a Muslim scholar, and we've always had a Mormon scholar, because those are the three areas you might think of in the Abrahamic traditions that I've been personally very involved in. I'm just finishing 20 years of co-chairing Evangelical Mormon Dialogue, which is kind of off to the side in a lot of other places, but we've been very, very active in that. Secondly, kind of formation for interfaith engagement. I mean, here I find Leonard Swidler's Dialogue Decalogue extremely helpful, and not just as a list of sort of 10 commandments, but to really get into it and to think theologically about issues like what is the relationship between evangelism and dialogue? As my friend Bob Millett, the Mormon scholar, says, we've been at this for 20 years, and I would love to see Rich Mao become a Mormon, and I know he would love to see me become an evangelical. So that's always sort of there in interfaith encounter, certainly from the evangelical and the Mormon side. But even if those conversions don't take place, we can have successful dialogues. That is because we're not there to win arguments. We're not there to convert. We're there genuinely to understand. And the Swidler 10 Commandments are very important, that you have to enter into it with a learning posture. And so there we might think of character formation for interfaith engagement is very important. And then finally, across the curriculum, I mean, again, it's not just an elective option off on the side, but we need to think biblically about it. I mean, you think of Paul on Mars Hill. I mean, there's some interesting stuff to think about there when he engages in dialogue on Mars Hill. And thinking systematically, a theology of religions. And there you get into all the stuff about natural theology, general revelation, common grace, all of these kinds of things. And the history of it. I mean, just to have people know in higher education that the Muslim community has had a wonderful contribution to the studies of Aristotle. And just great stuff there. And then the practices of ministry. And I could say more about that later, but that's enough for me.
Thank you, Professor Mao. Professor Moriarty?
Thank you. And once again, thank you for organizing this. I'm sure I will also learn a lot from the other colleagues and from the questions from the audience later. So let me just say a few words about the institution where I work. So I work at the Faculty of Religion and Theology at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. So it's the Free University of Amsterdam. We're not supposed to say it like that, but anyway. So this Department of Religion and Theology is rooted in Reformed tradition. And it continues to be strongly committed to Christian tradition, but since about 2000, it started to reinvent itself. First by implementing a trajectory in Islamic theology and later Islamic spiritual care. And later by becoming really a multi-faith center where not only Protestants from various denominations, and then I mean Mennonites, Baptists, Pentecostals, Evangelicals, Eastern Orthodox, and what we call restored Reformed Protestants, they would be a group of students who do not really believe in ecumenical dialogue, let alone interfaith dialogue, come together with also Hindu students, Buddhist students, Jewish students, and Islamic students. And within this department, it's a very complex department. I'm not going to go into the details, but within this department, students will be trained to become religious scholars. So really looking at the phenomenon of religion in all its complexity from the outside perspective. You will also have more classically trained Christian theologians in various trajectories, Mennonite theology, Baptist theology, and so on and so forth. Students might also be trained as peace builders, or there's a trajectory in building interreligious relations. So that's really a trajectory focused specifically on interfaith learning. And then there are many trajectories in what we will call Islamic spiritual care, Buddhist spiritual care, Hindu spiritual care, and also interfaith spiritual care. All those students come together in this department, but it also means that our staff is multi-faith. So where perhaps in a way, as our colleague Davidson was also saying earlier, we started out perhaps as a Christian department welcoming others. At a certain moment, you can no longer see yourself as that. So today we are really a multi-religious department and an interfaith department, trying to find new ways to think of ourselves, to think about our curriculum, and to make this work. And I could pretend it's all flowery and happy and so on and so forth, but sometimes it's also just really difficult because our students are not all liberal students. They might also be very conservative and secular students. Not all of our students come to this department because they're also yay about interfaith learning, but they sometimes just come to our department because they want to be trained in restored Reformed theology, and this is the only place in the Netherlands where they can do that. Or they want to be trained as a Buddhist spiritual caregiver, and this would be the only place where you can do that. So we, in a way, welcome all of those students and all staff members on the condition that next to really delving deeply into their own confessional or non-confessional background, they're also willing to train their academic skills and engage in dialogue with those of other faith. And so that mixtures of academic skills, learning to go deeply into your own traditions, as well as dialogical engagement is what makes our department, I think, in a way also quite unique and really fun to work at as an interfaith educator. I think I will leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you. I believe we have Professor Ortega next.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Noah and others who work in organizing this event. And I look forward for the conversation with my colleagues and also with the audience. So talking about Midvo Lombard Theological School and how we conceive interreligious engagement and dialogue, I need to start by saying that we are kind of in a very unique position. Right. So the larger we are affiliated with the Unitarian Universalist Association, that is our larger faith identity movement, Unitarian Universalists. So one of the particularities that this present for us as a school is that while we may have a very robust congregational polity, we have a non-dogmatic theological outlook. What that has allowed for us to do is kind of the reality that it is very likely that the Unitarian Universalists belong to multiple religious traditions. If I kind of were to be fully honest, I can say that perhaps the best way to characterize many of the members of the faith movement is those who are religious migrants from other faith traditions. And largely, a segment of these folks have come to Unitarian Universalism because they're seeking for a more liberal religion or a religion, a faith that is more active in the public square. It is also a space where folks who have interfaith families make a home, right? So we may become a place of negotiation of multiple faith traditions as folks are considering creating a family. For example, etc. So what this entails then in practice is that Unitarian Universalists will have the muscle to navigate and be really fluid as they enter in and out of multiple religious traditions. So when it comes to theological education, one of the possibilities that I think has helped us engage in interfaith dialogue is that there is already an inbuilt presupposition, right, that folks are open to interfaith dialogue because they themselves may be navigating multiple religious belonging. Now, on the flip side of that is also the reality that what oftentimes comes into practice is that we have a presumed mastery of multiple religious languages and traditions, but not actual kind of really embedded and deep knowledge into how to navigate the multiple identities, which meaning that at the end of the day, there is Unitarian Universalism as a polity wins the day, right? So it becomes kind of a substratum in which we use either a faith tradition as an adjective or a noun, right? So you can be a UU humanist, or you can be a Buddhist UU, right? But whatever the UU is and identify, right, it shifts depending on the person. So in theological education, I think in how it's lived out in Midville Theological School, we also see some of those kind of fray lines into how do we engage it. So over the years, we have maintained very good relationship to other faith traditions. In particular, we have a partnership with Risiko Sekai in Japan. We have some partnerships in India, and we have students who come from very interesting religious backgrounds. But what is missing in some ways is the larger conversation. And how do we distinguish what is uniquely Unitarian Universalist of how do we enter into interreligious conversation and interfaith conversation, right? What are the ethics that at times guide those particular conversations, and how do we engage the religious tradition, and particularly in terms of theology, in terms of ethics, the interconnection between those two in our curriculum is a little bit more complex, right? And I think like many other seminaries, we maintain courses that deal with those particular identities, and we offer courses of faith tradition, and we make an effort to bring right into our larger learning community the ethos to speak in plurality. I think and I would close by saying that for me, one of the things that I would love to see not only in Midville Lombard, but I think also in Unitarian Universalism as a whole, right, is the ability to do the full articulation of this is how we enter into spaces of interreligious dialogues, and this is the clarity this is the clarity that we need to bring in the space as we navigate multiple religious belongings. And I can say, for example, in my own personal life as an administrator, that is something that I am negotiating. What is the traditions that I bring into my work, and what are the traditions that sustain the more private spaces, right, of faith formation and family care and other aspects of that nature.
Thank you, Professor Ortega. Rabbi Rose.
Thank you so much, Noah, for the invitation to participate in this conversation. And I'm moved by so much that others have already said. Hebrew College is a hybrid institution and has been for close to 100 years, which means that in addition to the training of Jewish professionals, we're also very involved in community education, both for adults and for youth. In the context of this conversation, I want to speak about the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College, because it's the largest of the seminary programs. And there, like the rest of the college, the school is guided by a pluralistic ethos, which is to say, internal to Hebrew College, we invite folks intentionally from various walks of Jewish life. We are not affiliated with any of the major denominations, and we work with all of them. And many of our students make the decision to work within specific denominational contexts or not. One of the things that I want to say about interfaith or interreligious education at Hebrew College is that it really does grow from the soil of that commitment to intra-Jewish pluralism. And so we try and cultivate habits of heart and mind within the context of the Jewish community and across religious communities that are in sync. And of course, that has to permeate the entire curriculum. And so we've been trying to think carefully about the classroom and co-curricular opportunities. How are these sensibilities alive in practice in courses on Tanakh, on the Hebrew Bible, rabbinics, medieval Jewish thought, modern Jewish history, etc. And we also try and create specific courses and co-curricular opportunities beyond what we might call the established or conventional academic fields of endeavor. So it's a yes and approach. And I'll just say that one challenge for us at Hebrew College is that the program is designed to be intensive in terms of engagement with language, various versions of the Hebrew language from the Hebrew Bible to the present, and textually grounded. And so students come oftentimes with much more experience living out thickly other parts of their identities. And they come specifically to Hebrew College for a deep dive into all things Jewish. And so balancing that curricularly, existentially, and so forth is always a challenge. When and where and how do we continue to focus on the particularity of their journeys as Jews? And when and how and where do we intentionally engage with others? We've had the great benefit over the last 15 years of having wonderful partners. As many of you know, for a long time, we had the privilege of sharing a hilltop campus with Andover Newton Theological School, and that was intentional. Hebrew College moved to that plot of land on our beloved Faith Hill in order to be, as one colleague describes it, cheek to jowl with Andover Newton Theological School. And we had a living laboratory, to use the language of one of the great American religious pluralists, the Reverend Howard Thurman. We had this lab, and we had wonderful experimentation. And since Andover Newton has left and embedded itself in the Yale Divinity School, we forged partnerships with other institutions within the Boston area, specifically and most deeply with Boston University School of Theology and Boston College, which of course represent two very different forms of Christian faith and activity. In any case, that's the beginnings of a description of the school, specifically of the rabbinical school, and how we're going about our business and some of the challenges.
Thank you, Rabbi Rose. I now invite Professor Syeed.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet all of you and see very many good friends over the years together. So I also wanted to add, I think in my bio, for some reason, this year, Heidi Hadsel and I edited a volume on critical perspectives in interreligious education under the edited series that Marianne Moyart actually serves as a lead for. And then I also wanted to share with people that I had an article come out on intersectionality and interreligious education in Kwok Poilan's edited volume on Asian American and Asian women in theology and religion, both of which were subjects of panels at the AAR this year. So I'm sharing that because there is a proliferation of scholarship engaging ethnic studies, decolonial perspectives, and other lenses in interreligious education. So I'm also part of an experiment of having a sort of a Protestant institution work with the Muslim community to build a graduate Muslim seminary. So for 10 years, I was at Claremont School of Theology as a professor of interreligious education, which incubated and worked with the Muslim community to create Bayan Graduate School, which is a Muslim graduate seminary. Bayan and I independently moved to Chicago Theological Seminary. So we're now replicating that collaborative environment of a decade in Chicago through Chicago Theological Seminary. So my story is across two institutions, having joined Chicago's faculty this year. As CTS, its commitment to interreligious education is deeply tied to a justice-based educational value system. If you hear our president describe, President Stephen Ray, the history of CTS, it's connected to its abolitionist roots more than 100 years ago. So he sees this, and we see this notion of interreligious education as embedded in the notion of, as our commitments and our missions say, a recognition that we are a UCC institution that engages multi-faith communities. Our commitments also articulate a recognition in the United States of Christian privilege, and also tie this interreligious modality of education and an encounter to notions such as looking at economic and social class structures that sustain poverty. And another piece of our commitments and actually our programming have been around the fragility of the planet and the notion of interreligious engagement, activism, and community development on environmentalism. So the history of our actual embedded institutional interreligious education is quite old as well. We have an institute called the Interreligious Institute that formerly was an institute based on Christian, Muslim, and Jewish learning. And you must have heard from Rabbi Mikva, who is our Jewish Studies chair, and I now occupy the Muslim and Interreligious Studies position at CTS. So we are one of the few interreligious graduate seminaries making that explicit commitment, dedicating faculty positions. And 10 years ago, I actually helped to co-teach the first interreligious course at Chicago Theological Seminary while I was still at Claremont. And so I would explain our approach as a curricular approach across the curriculum. Also, we have a very robust co-curricular approach to interreligious engagement that is not just a space for our students and not just a space for Chicago community-based organizations, but really has become a robust national stage for programming. And the faculty, as well as the community around and surrounding the institution, take the notion of community partnerships very seriously. So as we begin to think about our curriculum and the stage of interreligious education, I think one of the questions was that we've already had is this just in theological education? And I would say part of our mission is to think about preparing our students. We have, for instance, an MDiv concentration in interreligious engagement. However, I think we see the scope of education far beyond the walls of theological education, and that's why community partnerships are so important. So within one semester, you'll have a program, for instance, that we held on Muslim political engagement. And so we engage all of the organizations that do political organizing in the Muslim community in the US. So I think that social justice-based education, by definition, sees the whole world as its laboratory. And that part of the goal is to think about how these concepts figure in real life. And so I will stop there.
Thank you, Professor Syeed, and thank you for adding those additional citations, and to all of you. Our goal for the remainder of our time is to make this as conversational and dynamic as possible. So I will open it back up to the panel to sort of, I'll restate my initial question now that we've heard from each of us, each of you from your institutions. Is there an academic category of interfaith education in seminaries and divinity schools that sort of transcends each of the programs that you're working on? If so, what constitutes it? How much is it sort of really the subservient to other commitments that your institutions have already made, as you explained in some cases? And I'll also, just before I turn it back over, remind the audience to please post any questions you have for the panel in the Q&A feature, and we will turn to those subsequently. So anyone can jump in. What are some thoughts you have after hearing from your co-panelists?
One of the things that strikes me and certainly animated the vision that we have had when we started 2 years ago to push into this new direction for interfaith education is the fact that we are living into a space where the sort of walls of denominational identity or sectarian religious identities are not as solid as we want to think they are. But the reality is we inhabit institutions that were created to maintain those structures. And so we are dealing with a time, whether it be, I think Professor Ortega articulated this quite well, the kinds of multiple belongings that people are having, the interfaith families that are being formed, as well as I would want to think of the fluidity that people have in terms of their religious expressions, is creating a need for religious leaders of a different sort than we have had. So for us, trying now to create an identifiable category called interfaith will run counter to that idea, that essentially what we want to do is to say, if you're actually going to think of yourself as a religious person, you have to already take on a pluralist outlook. And so the formation academically, intellectually, theologically, in terms of practice and social being, has to be pluralist. I mean, I don't know that our educational structures as well are able to keep up with that, except, of course, if we keep producing the kind of material that Professor Syeed was describing that she's been a part of.
So I saw one of the questions to sort of answer your question, Noah, as well as the question in the chat. I think online education is something that has to be acknowledged as the present as well as future of US-based theological education. And it's difficult. It's a complex matter to think about pedagogically as a professor. This week, I'm teaching all week Managing Interreligious Nonprofits, Perspectives on Ethics and Management from Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, and indigenous perspectives in one class. So, but what's remarkable is I think as we move forward, I do think that there is an ability within theological education to have an impact across the board of disciplines that we teach. But I also think that there are some of us that are developing an expertise in being able to teach multi-religiously, and not just from that comparative theology approach or comparative practical theology. And even theology is structured and in such a way that it is often a Christian-derived term when we enter into multiple religious spaces of scholarship. But I do think that there is a specialty in some ways, whether or not it is a discipline that has its own character and its own boundaries. I think in general, that is a time that is gone in the academic world anyways. My doctoral students are all interviewing for positions in which they have to have multiple capacities for teaching, because the shrinking of the academy is creating this reality where I can't just go and be the scholar of a medieval text or period and expect that's what I'm going to teach. And I don't think that was ever really the case, but it's even less so the case now. And so I would have us think through the capacity of what online education does to open up the doors for much broader scopes of geographic reach. Today I had someone that was taking my class in Hawaii, then someone else on the East Coast. So it's no longer that I'm also even just serving a narrow geographic scope. And in many ways, that expansion has created new horizons that are constantly moving. So I'll end there and let someone else contribute.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah. One of my big concerns is the relationship of all of this to the grassroots. A lot of the question, Timothy George, back when some of us were working on a project called Evangelicals and Catholics Together, Tim George, who was president of another evangelical seminary, made the comment that for evangelicals, ecumenism, and I think this is also true of interfaith concerns, typically trickles up rather than trickles down. Where the presidents or the CEOs of our big denominations don't get together with rabbis, Muslim leaders and the like. My own experience has been a businessman from Phoenix who calls me and says, "I understand you're doing a Mormon evangelical dialogue. My business partner is a Mormon, and all I've ever heard was how bad they are and all the rest. But when we have lunch together, he prays. And he sure sounds like he's praying to the same God that I am. And he prays in the name of the same Jesus that I love. If he were to ask me to pray, which I'm afraid that he might do the next time we're at lunch together, is it okay? You know? Or we did a thing in a local community, evangelicals and Mormons together, and one evening, and afterward we had refreshments, and I warned the church that sponsored this not to have coffee. But these two couples were talking very energetically, and they called me over and they said, "Thank you. We are neighbors. We've lived next door to each other for 10 years, and we've never talked. We wave, but we've never talked. We've been kind of nervous because they know we're evangelicals. We know they're Mormons. But tonight you gave us permission to talk. And we're actually going to have lunch together." You know? Now, here's the thing. I hope they don't get into talking about the Trinity, because I don't think either side would have a very coherent view of it. But the importance of simply, how do I deal with my Muslim grandchildren? You know? My daughter is going to marry a Jewish guy, and she's decided to convert to Judaism. Would you be willing to meet with them just to talk about how they can navigate this interfaith marriage kind of thing? And I do think that it's one thing to talk about interfaith dialogue, and it's another thing to talk about interfaith neighbors, you know, or interfaith grandparents. And I worry a little bit that these discussions very quickly, and you know, I believe in scholarship, believe me, but that we get stuck on the high level of training religious leaders who understand many different faith perspectives, and we're not thinking about the couple that's got that has Muslim grandchildren, and they're evangelicals or they're Unitarians, and they don't know how to handle it. And I do think we need that kind of focus in theological education as well. And I really like what Professor Davis, and he used the word right at the beginning of his early remarks, talked about hospitality. When I was president of the ATS, we developed this report, which I did not like, about interfaith theological education. And I thought it was very elite Union Seminary, more than, say, Dallas Seminary. And we sent it back for more work. And they came back with a report that focused on hospitality. And that'll, as we say in the evangelical world, that'll preach, you know. Hospitality, making room, sharing space in your heart and your soul for other people. My Muslim sister who's on this, she and I have been on a gig one time, and she was telling me, I think you'll remember this, she was telling me about the ways in which Muslim kids get bullied in schoolyards in Southern California. You know, that too is a very big issue in interfaith relations. And we can do a lot with that without talking about the Trinity.
I deferred to Richard because he was tilling these fields long before I was a glimmer in my parents' eye. And I want to start there. One of the educational pieces that matters to me is to try and better understand, communicate, and build upon the people that have come before us in this field. And there is a genealogy within the modern context, within the modern North American context, but of course, it also goes back much farther and wider than that. But to think about a Richard Mouw and Elliot Dorff 30 or 40 years ago experimenting, or to think about Howard Thurman, whose name I mentioned before, mentoring, right, a very young Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. And I say that as a bridge to your question, Noah, which is to say, yes, I think there is a distinct field that is emerging that involves research, publications, reflection on pedagogy, scope and sequence, questions about universality and particularity. But I think in many respects, we should learn from other disciplines that understand the porousness, as Najeeba made mention of it earlier, and the ways in which interfaith is also interdisciplinary. In fact, there are subfields. So, some of our students are very interested in interreligious activism. Others of our students are very interested in text study. Others of our students are interested in pastoral care. By the way, studying the emergence of a field like pastoral care, I think is quite instructive because it has very quickly become a part, an arterial part of seminary and divinity school education far and wide. One other piece to mention is that just as our communities are more porous, so are these academic fields. And so the methods and the models and the lived experience in that sense dovetail. And in respect to what Richard just said, I think one of the major breakthroughs for this nascent field of endeavor is the understanding that the study of religion has to be carried out in some different ways. And obviously, in this context, the work of Diana Eck and the Pluralism Project and their adaptations of case studies and so forth, and the work of the Interfaith Youth Corps, and it's insisting that academic and seminary communities are also in conversation with grassroots organizations, is all vital. And I do think that there is a field that is taking shape. And at the same time, I would say, in my experience from my location, there is a kind of layering. That is, when I talk about the development of habits of heart and mind, what we might call in Hebrew midot, right? Or as Catherine Cornell describes, the virtues of interreligious dialogue. Many of those must be operative within one's own community. An understanding of the power and importance of humility, both theologically and epistemologically, an understanding of our interconnection, both to humankind and the rest of the created world, et cetera, et cetera. So again, my answer is a yes and, but I do feel like there is a field that is emerging. And for some of us, it's both very exhilarating and frightening because it feels like we are building this bridge as we're crossing it, as our friend and colleague Ibu Patel likes to say. So maybe I'll end by saying thank you for your hammer and nails and the supplies that you're bringing to this endeavor, all of you.
I'm thinking something to add to this conversation. And one of the challenges that I'm facing is which hat do I put on to speak first? My scholar hat, my administrator hat, or my hat as somebody who works in faith communities, who's also a parent? Because the answer to this question look very different from all those angles. Right. And I think as an academic, I'm very aware that the model that we oftentimes inhabit in theological education or religious studies has been framed by Christendom in particular ways. And the exception of that is a particular kind of political project of some sort of evangelism for conversion. Right. So that really creates a particular kind of fracture in how the academy works and how it has been self-organized into what does the field actually contain to or amounts to, or how do we even shape what theological education look like? And I think for many of our institutions are accredited by ATS. And I think this is, for me, is the bridge between my academic hat and my administration hat. And it's like, how do we, if we are taking the move to liberalize our curriculum in ways that honor the reality of how society is changing in terms of religious pluralism, how are we going to put the pieces together to go to those kinds of accreditations, right? And also what does entail in terms of finances and how do we have to reshape what our faculty looks like? who are our partners? How do we move our resources, right? That is a conversation that kind of bridges that gap between the scholarship and the academic world. And I fear that at times, perhaps in the interreligious dialogue conversation may be somewhat stunted, right? Because we're trying to navigate all those pressures in terms of financial resources that enter into play in who do we engage and how, but also the ways in which our constituencies will be responding to some of those shifts and the pressure that they might make. And the last thing, as a parent, right, who's also an academic and administrator, one of the things that I see in theological studies, at least in the context that I have been either part of teaching or administrating, is that folks come into seminary a lot less formed, right, in spite of their faith tradition. So somehow they're learning about their faith tradition in seminary versus, 15, 20 years ago, in whatever the faith tradition, you become somewhat formed, right? You have a context and there's some theological grounding, some practice, rituals, right? You experience and practice a lot of rituals, but folks are learning this in seminaries or theological schools. And I think that bodies of faith are also expecting that formation happen in seminary primarily. So we have 3 years or 4 or 5 years to kind of help shape right, the next generation of religious of faith leaders, right, in the context that is really a generational work to make that happen. So I'm saying all this to say that as we're thinking, right, part of the turn into how do we live into more interfaith or pluralistics presence, right, or see the future, we really have to think about what are the resources that we have available that we can mobilize, right, quickly and effectively to ground the work institutionally, so it's sustainable. So it is just not the initiative, but it is ongoing process. Also, the kind of work that we have to do with our constituencies, right, to understand that this is not just something new or funky. This is part of the reality in which we're shifting. And in fact, the more versed and the more practiced we are, right, the more honest we can be in the conversations that we are having with one another. We need to break together to do it. And I think in terms of the future, right, how do we manage our institutions in ways that affirms and help nourish what faith traditions look like, not only for the ones that mark our identity, but others? I think it's one of those bridges, right, or one of those boundaries that still has to remain on porous, where we have not been efficient in how to cross those boundaries of interreligiosity and plurality within institutions themselves.
Yeah, thinking of my own department, I think, and of the field of interfaith studies, I think it's important that interfaith learning happens in many places, and that we should not see them as exclusive spaces, but rather as spaces that can complement one another, enrich one another, challenge one another. So I think it is important that people who are still very much rooted in their own faith tradition are respected in that rootedness, and but are trained in such a way that they do not see being committed to their own faith tradition as in an opposition to being open to those of other faiths. So I think it's extremely important that we invest in proper theological training, whether it's Islamic theological training or Christian theological training of whatever kind, or in being in rabbinic studies, but that people learn that it is quite possible to be deeply versed in your tradition, committed to your community, as well as being open to those of other faiths. So if interfaith learning would be in opposition to being committed to or still having a very strong religious identity, I think that would be problematic, and I think we would lose something. At the same time, I think it's important that we also train specialized interfaith scholars that are committed to tracing the history of interfaith relations and moving beyond certain normative assumptions about pluralism and about interfaith learning. For example, the idea that pluralism is new. How is this new? It's been all over the world, everywhere. It's only new in Europe, and then even then, only if you rewrite European history and forget about Spain, forget about Portugal, forget about Hungary, and so on and so forth. If you rewrite European history from a Christian perspective, then it's always been monolithic and, oh, now it's becoming plural, but it's always been like that. So we need interfaith scholars with that critical consciousness, a historical consciousness, a genealogical consciousness, and so on and so forth, thinking not only that this is new, but this has been historically the reality. Thinking not only that this is something Western, but this is a global thing. Not only thinking about interfaith learning as a new export product that we will now bring to India or to Latin America, but please have some humility and see how you can learn from all of those other spaces. Thirdly, I think it is important that we also bring interfaith learning to a grassroots level, but let me rephrase that. Rather than bring interfaith learning to a grassroots level, sustain those who are already experimenting at a grassroots level with interfaith learning, and see also how our interfaith scholarship can learn from what is happening at the grassroots level. So I think it's important that we connect all of those different fields, and interfaith studies, interfaith scholarship, interfaith education has that capacity, because deep down, it's always about bringing together theory and practice. It's never about people doing stuff without reflection or people thinking about stuff without doing it. If you want to understand interfaith education, you have to delve in deeply.
Can I ask a question of Professor Moyar? You mentioned that you have students in that wonderful program at the Vrije Universiteit of the historic Reformed churches that on the grassroots level, most people, many of those folks are very hostile to the idea or very suspicious of the idea of interfaith engagement at all, beyond evangelism or, you know. And I've worked in very similar contexts. One of the problems is you get a student who goes through one of our programs and gets really excited about it, and then they can't go back to the churches or the theological programs that they were sent to your school to to serve, and that's a unique problem as well. I have a student from a very conservative church in Korea, and they want him to come back and get his PhD and come back and be on the faculty at their seminary. But he's beginning to have ideas that he thinks that he would not know how to teach his folks back home about these things. And I keep telling him, part of what you're supposed to be learning here is how to go back and effectively teach. But that is a big challenge for many of us in dealing with the connection between both of those areas that you've talked about, which I fully agree with you on that.
I think just a few thoughts. I mean, it's certainly true that what makes the department where I work unique is that we, to be quite honest, we kind of make people do interfaith learning without them necessarily wanting to do it, which is not usually the way it goes. Usually the interfaith space is a place where people want to be, and they're all good people and intentionally committed to being open to those of other faith. That's not necessarily the case, neither with the staff nor with the students. What we try to do is at the same time really making sure that there is an atmosphere where they are well taken care of. Now, this sounds perhaps too pastoral, but it's really important. So it's an institution. It's an institution where the students coming from different denominations, may I call it like that just for the moment, Restored, Reformed, of Baptist, Mennonite, Buddhist, Islamic, and so on and so forth, they have their own seminaries. Yeah, so they have staff fully committed to the specific or particular traditions. Yeah, 40%, even sometimes 60% of their education will be in those seminaries. 40% will be joint, with other students. And so there's always a balance between what are you learning in this interfaith space and how do you reconnect that with your community. And that sometimes gives tensions, but in real life they'll have tensions too. But the goal is never to somehow make them move away from their theological tradition or their faith tradition or and so on and so forth, but rather to always navigate between those. Does that make sense? And the way that we try to do that, you want to move towards a coherent identity also, so that people are still rooted in their tradition and know where they come from and where they want to go. And so what they do throughout the year is really reflect on who am I? Where do I come from? What's my vision? How does what I've learned relate to my theological tradition, to some of the values, to some of the narratives? How can I make sense of this? So sometimes people say, well, interfaith learning is something completely different than, for example, theologies of religions. And I would say, no, without the theologies of religions, for those students who are still deeply versed in their tradition, it could be the connecting thread also. And so rather than having them move away from, it's always about how do I make myself whole and integral, making use of all of the resources of my tradition and my scholarship. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
May I just add a couple of points, and then I think Najeeba is also interested in jumping in. Related to the previous piece of conversation, I want to come back to something I said earlier, and I'm living it this week. Like Najeeba, I'm teaching an intensive seminar, which is designed as a course in religious pluralism to acculturate new graduate students to Hebrew College. In our attempt to create a scope and sequence, one of the pieces that is required is that each year there are intensive seminars. And then there are a variety of electives and co-curricular activities, some of which are seasonal, etc. But one interesting anecdote from this morning was that I shared with students the text of the Havdalah service, which is the service of separation between the Sabbath and the weekday. And for some folks that are interreligiously minded, it's a complicated text because there's a sharp bifurcation between Sabbath, holiness, and the Jewish people, and mundane time, the nations of the world, and so forth. And so I introduced it to the students, and I showed them different interpretations, new liturgical innovations. And at some point, one of the students said to me, "Or, this is so interesting, it's so fascinating, and it's so important because you're asking me to think liturgically and theologically about the power of ritual and such. But I do have to tell you, this is the first year that I'm actually observing this ritual with any regularity." And it relates to Elias's comment, which is about how do you at once help people deepen their connection to their particular religious tradition, and at the same time engage in a thoughtful and critical analysis of those text, traditions, symbols, with a sensibility and a sensitivity towards the reality that we are a part of a much bigger and complex world. And that was just an interesting reminder about questions of scope and sequence. And Rich, I do want to say to you that I think much of the energy that I see among interreligious educators is about helping folks prepare vocationally. And so, yes, there is traditional theological, historical work to be done. But as you said, there's also vocational work that requires us also to draw from other disciplines. So, for example, when and where, as a synagogue rabbi, are you going to invite the local imam to your synagogue or to engage in an inter-religious and institutional initiative? Is that something you do in the first 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? To what extent are you familiar with people? Have you married people? Have you buried people? When and where are you going to give the sermon about, when you feel the community is too insular or inward looking, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, one of the flashpoints for us is the question of Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and so forth and so on. but to help students begin to think about when and where and how interreligious, cross-cultural, political, etc., is very much a part of the agenda, which is why I also return to this notion of case studies being really helpful, borrowed from the business world, in fact, but as another kind of modality. And then, of course, learning together, not learning about, but learning together. And our colleague Jenny Peace has a wonderful expression about co-formation. And I think that's very much one of the necessary innovations. You're preparing to be a rabbi. I'm preparing to be a priest. There are things that we can share and learn together. Are there trade secrets, as Reb Zalman used to describe it, right? I want to be in touch with Howard Thurman and Thomas Merton because, as Reb Zalman would say, I'm interested in the upaya, right? Trying to speak in several different religious languages simultaneously. What is the skillful means to move from my is to my ought that comes out of the depths of my own tradition, but is also very much alive and open to learning from other people and from other sources of wisdom.
Thank you all for this stimulating conversation. We could keep going for hours, I imagine. I want to make sure that we get some of the audience questions into the virtual space as well. And one of them is on one of the themes that I hoped we'd get to, which is how all of these dynamics are impacted by the global pandemic and by the upheaval that has caused in higher education more generally, the move to online learning, which Najeeba already mentioned in her opening comments. It seems on the surface that there are opportunities that presents. We can have Marianne with us here for this panel, even though she is across the ocean. If we were doing this in Hyde Park, that would have been much more difficult. And yet there are also real profound challenges of access, challenges of how do you engage in interpersonal, interfaith relationship building when it is mediated by a screen. And so I invite you all to sort of reflect on how has the pandemic, how has online education impacted these dynamics? What do you see for the future of this field in light of that?
I also wanted to add that I think we have to see, I think we're talking about different generations of students. So for a generation of student that is digitally native, this is not, for my kids who are 12 and 14, people were saying, oh, it must be so difficult. They can't go out during the pandemic. They seem to be fine. They're connecting with their friends. I'm just pointing out that I think when we talk about higher education and we talk about vocational training, we have, and many seminaries in the US do attract folks that are coming for second and third professions. So I'm just pointing out, even in one classroom, you have multiple generations, in addition to issues around race, religion, language. So I just wanted to point that out because I think in some ways for some for some educators, both professors and educators, as well as students, this is not as new in terms of relating through digital means as it is for others. So I just kind of wanted to name that it is an upheaval in terms of the reality of the virus. The method of learning is different, but it's not necessarily as shocking. I think going forward, one of the things that we haven't really talked about is also in the United States, the racial reckoning, which coincided with the disproportionate number of African Americans. And we don't have, also in Los Angeles, Latinx populations. And I think that leaves an inextricable sort of link between this moment in history of opportunity to engage and understand how religion as well as spiritual traditions play a role in not just being a critical component in how we engage and think about the world, but also how we think about the political world. And I've found in my work, the notion of political theology has become very important, particularly comparatively. So I just wanted to say, in some ways, the relevance is people are asking moral questions of our time. And this makes our work far more relevant if we are open to those conversations. And I wanted to kind of just pose that to think through. Theological education is in a moment where religion is empirically in a decline in terms of congregational numbers, but yet these moral questions are even more present in the public square. So how do we begin to think about education for that public square as well?
So I find it important to also talk about the way in which the digital space then enables a kind of communication that would not have always happened among groups that in some ways may have been historically disempowered. It struck me as we were talking that one of the things that we are doing is defining interfaith education as a sort of anti-racist, anti-imperial posture. That it is in many ways attacking the narrative that has been shaped by a largely Eurocentric Christian nationalist identities. And making space for many of these other types of ways of thinking about faith is precisely the work that's being done. And I'm not too sure how often we want, how comfortable many people are naming it in that very bold way. But the thing that has happened is that these disempowered communities now have already been predisposed, which we have found, prepared actually to do the kind of engagement to facilitate the level of education that we're talking about, because they have relied a lot more upon digital space than some of the more fully established sort of religious movements, which have been now very much organized around the place, organized around this sort of a central type of shrine. And I think if we start to think about it in these ways, the ethical questions I think that Professor Syeed is raising, particularly the political ones, the ones about power, start to come into a sharper focus than we have actually started. We have engaged them before. Let me just while I'm going to say one thing, because for me it was interesting seeing how competent the sort of religious rituals of the presidential inauguration in the U.S. are. I think we had religious people who were competent enough to not create rituals that were too sectarian. I was, that's important. But then what you have is this conscripting of religious leaders, largely Christian, to sanctify the power of the state. So it's the questions: how do religious leaders now come to terms with these political and civic rituals and practices that are embodied into a state that has enormous military power? And you're calling upon all of the religious people to say, so those are questions that I think, big political and ethical questions that are also important for us. To what extent then do Muslim Americans inherit or participate with Christians in the US, a kind of a sanctification of the state, of the US state? Those are big questions for us to engage.
I would like to also return to the potential and also the obstacles to online interfaith learning. I don't know how it's in the US, but I've been teaching online since March. So I was training leaders in the Netherlands in an interfaith program, so social workers, spiritual caregivers, teachers, school principals, civic servants, artists, and religious leaders in one program. When overnight we went into a lockdown for 4 months. So we had to switch like in 1 week. And this was a full day interfaith program from 9 to 5, very much learning via your head, your heart, and your body. And on the one hand, I'm struck by everything you can do. So we've done things we thought were not possible, and we would never have believed that this was possible. We had beautiful conversations, in-depth dialogues, in smaller groups. Some of the conversations may not have even been possible when they met in a physical one. I don't know how you say that actually, anyway, offline, whatever. Because there's something, I don't know what it is, but there's something with the screen which makes you both in proximity and in a certain distance, which sometimes allows people to really ask questions in a way they wouldn't if they would be actually very nearby. I don't know what it is, but there's something about screen that allows people to be even more open about certain issues. That being said, I think there's a serious problem with interfaith learning moving online completely, and that's the fact that it leads again to a certain disembodiment, which is already negatively affecting interfaith learning, because a lot of people come to the space of interfaith learning thinking that religion is about beliefs and that interfaith learning is about talking. And the dialogical dimension of interfaith learning reinforces a belief-oriented understanding of religion. That it's all about the mind rather than about the body. It's all about believing rather than doing. And so we've managed to create, all of us, I think, create interfaith programs that also bring in the body, bring in ritual, bring in practice, and so on, and the material dimension of religion, and so on and so forth. But when you move online, precisely those aspects which are not added on to religion, but are an intrinsic part of what it means to be religious, tend to move to the back again. We focus on discourse, again, we focus on dialogue, again, we focus on beliefs. What do you think? How do you see this? Relate your story, your personal narrative, and so on and so forth. And the ritual, the material dimension moves to the back. And so I think if we want to really make this work, this online teaching, and see the potential, not just the obstacles, we will have to remain sensitive to how do we bring in the material dimension in interfaith learning. And we've gotten better at it, but I think it's an issue of concern.
Marian, I wanted to follow up on your comments because one of the richest interreligious experiences that I've had to date was a project that I shared in with folks from the Interfaith Youth Corps, which was, an online multimedia project on the Book of Psalms. And we created what we called Psalm Season, which grew out of a course that I was teaching with a colleague from Boston College. And we were forced to go online. And I noticed, as you described, that the conversations, because of the urgency of the moment, but also the medium in ways I don't fully understand, helped to create a certain kind of depth. And in fact, the class itself became a ritual for people in a time where many people talked about other conventional rituals just not feeling meaningful in the ways that they might in quote unquote ordinary time. And then when we launched this project very hurriedly, thousands and thousands of people felt like there was a need for a space for meaning making that at once was rooted in ancient texts and traditions, including and specifically texts that have been used by so many people in times of trouble and pain and dislocation. But the thing that was most powerful to people, music, poetry, spoken word, personal storytelling, visual art. And again, it was just a good reminder about the ways in which we as educators and practitioners need to think about material culture and what it means, to be embodied practitioners and such. And that was a very powerful lesson that I want to try and carry forth, from a situation that I didn't invite or proactively think about.
So I regret that I need to unfortunately bring our conversation to a close. There are so many more questions that I would love to ask, and I know that the audience has as well. I will offer folks, particularly those who haven't spoken more recently, to offer any very brief closing thoughts that you might have, and then we will conclude our time together. I don't know if Professor Ortega or Professor Mao, if either of you have any final thoughts you want to bring into the room. Great. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say to Dr. Mao first, and then I.
No, I've been surprised in the last 2 weeks how many times I've heard the word existential used. I thought existentialism was gone, and all of a sudden it's being existential is a big thing. But I want to say the last course I taught at Fuller had 33 students. We did a public theology course, and somehow it was right around the time that the president was saying bad things about Wuhan in China. And somebody just mentioned that in passing. And then there was a young Chinese woman in the class who said, I'm in Wuhan. This is where I live. I'm in Wuhan right now. And let me tell you what's happening in my neighborhood. And there were students who said at the end that was one of the most important experiences that they had in the course. I mean, and there's something, and this woman would not have been able to come to Pasadena to take the course. And there's something about that existential location that is made possible by online learning. That I agree with everything that Mariana said on the other side of the ledger. But there are real gifts that come from the accessibility to each other that is made possible by online presence.
I think my last comments, I was thinking of a question that Robin Lovin posted, right, on secularism. And I think this is an interesting question because I think secularism can be used as a way to close conversations. But if you're really honest and pay attention, what we see is a tacit admission of a kind of an evangelical ethos in the public sphere. And if it's not that, then it gets kind of pushed aside, right, in very unique ways. So there's a particular ways in which versions of Christianity can speak in the public sphere without any fear of repercussion, in which other religions can't. I think that's very similar to what happens in movies, right, Hollywood and TV shows, when they're trying to portray religion is either a Muslim or a Catholic priest, right? There's usually, those are the types that gets kind of signal of something that we recognize in particular ways, and of course, more than likely, they are problematic representations, right? But it's kind of the shorthand. And I say that to say that I think it is important for us to recognize that religion is not going away, right? The dream of Durkheim and Webers and others that religion would eventually pass. Right, and some more enlightenment would came. It has shown that being enlightened and reasonable is not disconnected from also being religious and having a rich spiritual life. And I think what we are seeing is just a flourishing, right, of spirituality and religiosity, just in new ways that look at times familiar and oftentimes really unfamiliar to us, but is grounding, right, our present, right. And I think we need to be just attentive to that.
Thank you, each of you, so much from the bottom of my heart for your comments and participation today, and truly for being my and our colleagues and teachers for, in some cases, many, many years. Thank you very much.
And with that, I would like to thank the panelists also for really linking theory and practice in a way that we haven't gotten to so far in the symposium. So this was really a new stage, and I'm very grateful for it. I want to alert the audience to tomorrow's final webinar on the voice of emerging scholars, also starting at 4 p.m. Central Time. I want to thank NOAA and again IFYC and also the Luce Foundation, and remind the audience, if they can, to fill out the feedback form, because we very much would appreciate that. Thank you all for your participation.